and welcome to Medicamentum Authentica. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Today I have a special edition. I will not be interviewing any guests today, but I will be talking about the MKUltra and other government secret research programs, as well as giving you a book review of The CIA Doctors by Colin M.D. Sorry about the focus there. And subtitled Human Rights Violations by American Psychiatrists. And this is a very important book because it documents many of these government research programs that were done covertly over the 20th century. Now, I want to emphasize that Dr. Ross's analysis and research in this book is based on some very solid factual material. Predominantly, this includes thousands of pages of released documents that were declassified from the CIA and other government agencies in the United States about these projects, as well as case studies or case histories from some of the victims or subjects of this unethical covert research, as well as some information derived from lawsuits that were filed against the United States government that were most commonly settled out of court. So this is a very top-notch research and information, and required a substantial amount of work to go through all those documents and find the few excerpts that actually provided valuable information, because many of the documents and much of the information was redacted and blacked out, so they had to put this together. And also the book is organized in a very nice manner, sort of introducing government research and talking about some of the other medical research that was done earlier before this mind control research, including the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, as well as various research that was done with radiation exposure. I'm talking about atomic energy, nuclear radiation, et cetera, that led up to these other studies. Now, the MKUltra and associated programs began in the 1950s and officially continued through the 1970s, and there was a congressional hearing in 1977 that you can find information and excerpts that you can watch, or perhaps transcripts to learn more about what the participants testified to before Congress. But most likely these experiments or similar ones are still going on to this day, but there is a delay in the information being declassified and released so that we can know for sure. But certainly there is a lot of evidence we could look at that's beyond the scope of today's discussion. But I want to emphasize that these programs that I'm talking about were not just administered by rogue government agents or people within the spy community. And of course, those people did violate the CIA's charter, which prevents them from conducting any operations on United States soil, but they did this anyway. But in order to carry out these research projects, they had to essentially recruit a network across the United States of academic psychiatrists who could act as the investigators and carry out these experiments. And this is well documented in this material, and it includes very prominent and well-known universities across the United States, such as Johns Hopkins University, Georgetown University, Cornell University, the University of Denver, the University of Minnesota, and also includes some universities outside of the United States, and specifically McGill University in Canada. So this was quite an extensive research network that was put together, and these investigators who were involved at the highest levels had to sign secrecy agreements with the CIA or other United States government agency, which prevented them from disclosing to anyone information about these research projects. Now, people at the lower levels who participated were not told what the purpose of the experiments were for or who was funding them. They were just kept in the dark and paid to do the work, essentially. The subjects of these research experiments largely were made up by psychiatric patients in these hospitals and institutions, but also included other people, and including children, and variety of research projects, as well as other people who are marginalized in our society, such as the extremely poor, prostitutes, drug addicts, individuals like that. And the subjects of these experiments did not give consent, and they were not even told what was going on. So, for example, if they were in a psychiatric hospital to get some form of treatment, they were experimented on, funded by the CIA, but they were essentially told that they were just being given treatment and didn't uh, ever realize until after that they were part of an experimental protocol that was completely under the table. So I want to talk a little bit more detail about some of this material by reading a couple of excerpts or going through some material in this book to increase your education on this topic. So first of all, the idea of the Manchurian Candidate is highly associated with these covert projects, and there's some substantial information that there were real-life Manchurian Candidates that were created through these types of brainwashing and mind control research activities, and we all are familiar with the movie and the fictional account. However, it seems that this is more than fiction, as we often see through Hollywood soft disclosure. But in the subproject proposal for, subproject 136 in the MKUltra program, there was a document of the project proposal that was submitted for funding in May 30th, 1961. And in that document, and by the way, the funding was approved for this project, it stated explicitly that they were trying to deliberately create multiple personality disorder in children. So just to give you an idea of what some of the aims of this research was. Now, in addition to MKUltra, there were many other programs that were related but less well known, and that included MK Search, but also others such as Project Chatter, Q Hilltop, MK Naomi, and others. So I want to just highlight one because this involves a university that is very near to where I live, and that I have known people who have been employed or students of this university. And this was a project that began in 1954, and the aim was to study Chinese communist brainwashing techniques. Now, the goals of this were not overtly stated. However, there's some testimony from some Cornell doctor which provides this was for nefarious purposes. And this was under the Cornell Medical Human Ecology program. And it was later, this program was absorbed under MKUltra for funding, and not kept separate any longer. So I went and looked because this is, some related to the origins of the School of Human Ecology at Cornell University, and that college still exists. And I actually recalled the unusual title of that major from when I went to visit Cornell when I was looking at colleges to apply. Now, I didn't end up applying or going there, but I did visit the campus. And so on the website for Cornell University, where it talks about the College of Human Ecology, it states that there are 3 scholarly areas of excellence, and these include 1, health equity, 2, sustainability and society, and 3, technology and human flourishing. Now, these 3 areas line up exactly with various globalist documents and plans or incentives for the future, including the United Nations Agenda 2030 and Agenda 21. And also the World Economics Forum's Global Reset Initiative. And health equity is the driving force behind the lockdown and social isolation and other policies that we suffered from during the past few years, and essentially creates a collectivist type of framework or philosophy for public health. In other words, the good of the collective is greater than the good of any individual. And that's why we have to, quote, wear a mask to save grandma rather than to save ourselves, which would be the individualist point of view. Sustainability and society also has to do with these kind of agendas, which take us away from things like eating meat. They emphasize the fraud or fallacy of the human caused global climate change. And in fact, that's one of the main initiatives of this department. And then finally, technology and human flourishing, which essentially fits around social credit score systems and surveillance. So we can see that the same institutions that were involved with this covert research have maintained their alignment with the globalist agendas that would be supported by this type of mind control. So I want to cover one last subject from this book so that you can get an idea of what it was like for the individuals who are undergoing this type of experimentation and what they experience. So I'm going to give you a lesser well-known case study whose name was Linda McDonald. And she was from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, where the McGill program was undergoing at the Allen Memorial Institute under the direction of Dr. Ewan Cameron, who it's well documented was not only involved with Linda McDonald, but many other patients, and there were lawsuits successfully settled for large sums of money from victims of this research under Dr. Cameron's direction. So Linda essentially was a young woman who was never received any psychiatric treatment or had any mental health problems until she presented on this one occasion. And the details are not exactly clear, but essentially she was just going through a difficult time where she wanted to marry a man but did not have her parents' approval. And they went and eloped, and then her parents found out and there was conflict and they kicked her out of the home. And she was, living in her husband's attic, sneaking around while his parents were out of town, and it was a very difficult situation. So she went and checked herself into the hospital, and they essentially turned her into a subject of this research. Now, what they did to her is called de-patterning, and their goal was to essentially erase her memories or create a de-identification of her with her former self through using amnesia and other techniques. And they did this by exploiting as a principal mechanism electroshock therapy or ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Now, this is something that I had exposure to, especially in my training at Duke University as a psychiatrist. And I became very uncomfortable with this procedure because I saw that it really just caused a loss of memory and people forgot why they were depressed temporarily, but it didn't change anything for them. And I had observed this occur in some specific individual patients, and the ECT doctors kind of cut me out. They took me off the case, and they didn't want to talk to me anymore, even though I wasn't, openly critical at that time. But in Linda's case, what they did is not just do a regular course of ECT or shock therapy where they might do 8 or 10 treatments, but they did, 102 treatments, but within each treatment, they changed the procedure. So normally what happens when ECT is done is that they immobilize and sedate the patient, although I'm not sure if they did it during these experiments, and they deliver one single electric shock that induces a seizure in the individual, and they have to paralyze them so that they don't have all of the shaking motor aspects of the seizure, although we've seen in the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest that at some point they didn't do that. And people were shaking around violently and would have very sore muscles and risk injury. So I'm not sure how it was done in her case, but In her case, instead of just giving one shock during a session, they actually delivered 6 independent shocks during one session. So, since she had so many treatments and they were 6 times as much electricity as given in normal shock therapy, quote unquote, this resulted in her receiving the equivalent of over 600 regular shock treatments, and it was over 75 times the upper limit that was recommended by the American Psychiatric Association. So it's an extreme amount of electric shock. And while they were doing that, they employed other techniques, either simultaneously or afterward, to achieve this. And one of them was playing a repeated audio message to her between 250,000 and 500,000 times over a period of 20 days to try to program her with that information. And this procedure has been studied, combined with shock therapy, combined with various types of drugs, including stimulants and disinhibiting drugs, also with isolation and prolonged sleep. And those were 2 techniques that Linda experienced as well, including drug disinhibition, which would be using things like LSD and barbiturates, as well as prolonged sleep treatment, and that could last 30 days or longer, that they would essentially keep someone drugged and asleep for that prolonged period of time, as well as prolonged psychological isolation. And we know classically from experiences and experiments on prolonged psychological isolation that it can result in a lot of suffering and even loss of touch with reality, known as psychosis. So essentially what happened is that all these combined techniques in Linda's case, which were called depatterning techniques, resulted in permanent and complete amnesia. So everything in her life from her birth up until the point that she was admitted in her 20s, after that abuse and experimentation, she has never been able to recover any memories of herself before that time. But it's more than just the memories of what happened in her life. It's quite extensive. Now, before I get into the details of that, I want you to know that there were specific instructions that Dr. Cameron gave to her family upon her release. And of course, they didn't tell her family that she had been experimented on. They just acted as if this was the nature of her mental illness and the nature of the good treatment that they provided. But they gave her 3 instructions. They said, don't give her back her past. So in other words, don't tell her about her biographical history. Secondly, keep her away from her family, meaning her family of origin, as much as possible. And 3, don't teach her anything until she takes some initiative. And essentially, the medical records or the nursing records from the Allen Memorial Institute, in her case, described her that she was reduced to a vegetable state during her depatterning procedure. They said she was completely disoriented to her name, age, location, didn't recognize her children, couldn't read, drive, cook, or use a toilet, not only didn't know who her husband was, but didn't know what a husband was. So that's how severe the neurological insult was through this torturous research. It took 3 to 4 years before Linda was able to recover her short-term memory. In other words, for that 3 to 4 years, if you walked into a room that she was in and introduced yourself and had a conversation, and then walked away and came back 20 minutes later, she would have no idea who you were or that she ever met you. So that must have been very, very difficult. And she described kind of a small victory when she was really excited and told her kids, hey, look what I'm doing. And it turns out she had learned how to scramble an egg. So small victories. So Linda also continued to suffer after she was released with a dissociative disorder where she actually would spontaneously go into a state of being disoriented and was completely mute and unable to recognize people during these episodes, and even heard voices talking to her. And she was treated for a brief time after leaving the hospital for these problems, but then had no further psychiatric treatment subsequently. So we can see, that this was quite an extensive um, research program, completely covert and under wraps, where they exploited vulnerable individuals across the United States and in foreign countries such as Canada for the purpose of researching mind control techniques that they could use for operations that would benefit the intelligence agencies and the government, and of course, to use in policies perhaps that are still going on today, including how to manipulate populations on the mass scale. So it's imperative that you have this knowledge and learn about what the government actually has done and continues to do so that you can protect yourself and your family and understand the implications of these types of adverse activities. And hopefully, we can prevent this type of exploitation and human rights violations to occur in the future. And that's really what this is all about, so that you can open yourself to learn new knowledge, truthful knowledge that can help you and your family reach a state of amazing health and vitality. I hope this has been a helpful presentation, and I'm glad you took the time to listen. Signing out, Dr. Andrew Kaufman.